Okay, welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. We're moving on to item 6, which is consideration of a further draft statutory instrument, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Extension to Maritime Activities Order 2026. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has made no comment on the instrument in their report. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy back to the meeting and her supporting officials from the Scottish Government, who are Kay White, who's the team lead, Lachlan Hall, the Senior Policy Advisor, and Julia Bergham Pearson, a lawyer. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following the evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider to recommend that the instrument be approved. Again, officials can't speak under that item, but they can speak in this one. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make a short opening statement? And Cabinet Secretary, and I don't mean to bounce you, but we got the information that the impact assessment had been laid on Friday afternoon, which was after the committee papers had gone out, so it would be helpful for anything in there that you want to bring to our attention to use your statement to do that. So, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. So I'm pleased to provide evidence supporting the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Extension to Maritime Activities Order 2026. The ETS Authority, formed and jointly run by the 4 nations of the UK, is extending the scope of the scheme to include emissions from domestic maritime activities. And this builds on existing coverage of aviation, power generation and energy-intensive industries within UK ETS, and it incentivises cost-effective maritime decarbonisation and encourages efforts across our society and communities towards net zero goals. The expansion is focused on emissions related to domestic voyages between UK ports, as well as emissions at berth in UK ports, and will apply to ships of 5,000 gross tonnage or more. As a response to extensive stakeholder feedback, there will be exemptions for specific activities such as search and rescue, humanitarian aid and specific types of ship, including publicly funded research vessels. Importantly, for Scottish interests and our support for islands and peninsula communities, ferry services in Scotland are also exempt from the scheme, maintaining that essential connectivity to these areas, and fish catching and processing vessels are also exempted. The instrument under consideration provides technical detail on the practical aspects of bringing the domestic maritime sector into the UK ETS, such as regulation of operators, monitoring and analysis methodology, and annual reporting on maritime emissions. And as with other sectors included in the scheme, owners of in-scope vessels or those delegated on their behalf will purchase allowances for each tonne of CO2 emitted and surrender these at the end of each scheme year. And for maritime emissions, this will include a surrender reduction for voyages between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to avoid a carbon pricing imbalance. As the expansion to domestic maritime emissions will occur in July this year, arrangements will also be in place to allow double surrender of allowances for both shorter 2026 and full 2027 scheme years by April 2028. And it adjusts the ETS cap to allow account for the maritime sector. Scheme will extend to vessels which provide support or services for offshore structures from January 2027, including these ships at a later date, is an alignment approach that's taken in the EU ETS that avoids market distortions ahead of their equivalent inclusion in the EU scheme. The ETS Authority has consulted extensively on the inclusion of domestic maritime within UK ETS to ensure that it's incentivising emissions reduction in a way that's fair and accounts for industry best practice, including engagement with businesses across the UK, as well as specific workshops with our island communities. It represents an important step on the ongoing development of UK ETS, recognises the importance of maritime operations to our economy and net zero journey, and lays the groundwork for future expansion to international voyages, which was subject of a recent authority-wide consultation. And indeed, the business, the BRIA, was laid on the 30th of January after extensive engagement with Scottish businesses.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. What are the main impacts to Scottish businesses and individuals from the introduction of the maritime sector to the UK ETS next year?
Well, because of mainly because of the exemptions, there's actually a very limited impact on Scotland-based operators. There's a very small proportion, approximately 96% of costs are expected to fall on international operators. Obviously, we did extensive work with island communities and operators. We very quickly decided to exclude fishing and fish processing vessels as a result, and the Lifeline ferry services for island and peninsula communities as well, for the reasons that I've set out in my statement. So 96% of the costs are expected to fall with international operators.
I see that ferries to Scottish Islands will be exempt from the introduction of the ETS. The exemption is going to be reviewed in 2028. Now, my brief wee bit of research would suggest, for example, the Ham Navo would comfortably fall within the weight limit for ETS if the ferries exemption wasn't extended. Will the government continue to push for the ferries extension from the ETS?
Obviously, I can't preempt what the review is going to say, but obviously, given the reasons for actually having this exemption in the first place is around the kind of islands impact assessment and indeed the lifeline nature of these ferry services. So I don't think that will change, but obviously the review will take place.
Okay. And just before I move to other committee members, do you ever think that weight limit the tonnage limit will come down? Because, I mean, if it comes down too much, the MPV Jura might fall into it, which is one of our main fisheries protection vessels.
Well, obviously, there's a Four Nations discussion that needs to take place. As you rightly say, there's a 5,000 tonnage threshold that applies. The review of the threshold will be in 2028, and it will consider whether the threshold should be lowered in the future, but that's obviously a discussion that will happen between the Four Nations. And I think the review's got to... You've got to take into account the socio-economic impacts of inclusion of smaller ships. And obviously, just in the brief discussion that we've had here, we've talked to the nature of lifeline services and indeed fishing vessels being important to the socio-economic sort of aspect of communities around Scotland. So obviously we'll be bringing all that intelligence and those arguments to the fore in 2028 as well.
Well, hopefully in 2028, somebody might think that I've mentioned maritime protection vessels when it comes to the tonnage limit. Deputy Convener, you want to ask a question?
Thanks. Just in terms of those vessels that will be captured, and if 96% of them are international-based vessels, what's the primary options available to them to look at reducing their emissions levels?
So there's two aspects. There's the fuel that they're using for travelling, obviously, and the different types of fuels that there might be, the fuel switching that might be available. But there's also what they do when they berth. And actually, I think it's going to be quite an interesting innovation in Scottish ports to be able to offer different. I was in Montrose port a couple of months ago, and they were talking about how when ships that berth at Montrose can actually get electric power that is actually green electric power rather than using diesel when they're berthed as well. So this actually could be quite a good opportunity for ports to be actually offering different types of berthing fuel supply to whichever vessel as well. So there's obviously there's the fuel they're using for the travel that they're undertaking, and then there's the fuel that they're using when they're berthing as well. So there's options available to them then.
Is there options available for the fuel they use for travelling? Is there alternative options that they could? I'm conscious these are large vessels which probably would be much more difficult to be hybrid or electrified. And I suspect even in ports, I suppose I don't know whether electric generators would. I presume that's what you're talking about, electric generators, whether they'd be able to generate the level of power that they actually need as well. I'm not sure, just trying to understand.
It's not my area of expertise, but obviously the negotiations around this looked at the different types of biofuels that might be available. And obviously that's for the shipping companies and the international operators to decide how they want to decarbonise and have a look at the fuel options that might be available to them. But obviously, ultimately, that's a decision for them. Of course, they could decide that some vessels might not be able to decarbonise to a certain extent and will have to pay the fees associated and the additional costs associated with not decarbonising. But certainly I think it's very interesting that the berthing, you could be looking at cruise ships, for example, when they're berthing, they'll be able to, you know, hopefully in UK ports, have the option of taking on electric fuel supply to reduce the use of diesel, for example, while they're berthed.
Unless they're using diesel to generate the electricity for them, so I suppose it's a challenge.
I only have you know, one example in my mind of a particular port that we're actually using green electricity. And obviously, that's you're absolutely right. If that electricity is actually generated by diesel, then that's not going to have a carbon emission. But obviously, these instruments are sent to incentivise reduction in emissions. So, given that we all know that we've got constrained wind happening in Scotland, there's obviously a big opportunity for ports to maybe have arrangements with generators to be able to utilise the green electricity that otherwise would be constrained.
Okay, thanks.
Douglas, I think you've got a question.
Thank you, Camilla. Cabinet Secretary, how many ports at present in Scotland have that capability for, like cruise ships, for example, to connect?
I don't have that data in front of me. It's something that I would need to speak to my transport colleagues about. I don't have that information.
Would you think it would be a good idea to have an audit so people can see exactly what's planned?
I mean, it's very possible that that information already exists in the Scottish Government. I just don't have it in front of me just now.
So would you be able to send that to the committee?
Yes, we'll speak to our colleagues in the other departments and get that.
Thank you. And can I ask also, what is your plan for further decarbonising of vessels below the 5,000 tonne threshold? That's
something you'll need to speak to the Transport Secretary about. Obviously, I don't have the information about that, and I think I really don't want to get into something that's not really in my particular area, because obviously that's for the Transport Secretary. And then if you're talking about fishing vessels, obviously Ms Goujon will have the information on what incentivisation there is there. But I can certainly find out from both those portfolio areas and write to the...
I was thinking more within the climate change plan. Is there any mention of how we're going to decarbonise some of the smaller vessels below the 5,000 limit we've got in front of us today?
Well, I'll need to look into that specifically, but obviously the fuels that are available will be biofuels largely. If they wanted to decarbonise and stop using diesel, biofuels would be probably the most readily available option.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Briefly, Sarah, followed by Mark.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I'm thinking it would be good to get some joined-up thinking here, because we've talked before about biofuel opportunities, but seeing it in different ports, or electrification when you're charging major cruise ships, that would be interesting. My question was actually going to be about what is the estimated reduction in emissions in Scotland by bringing in these proposals, because the estimate is that 5% of the UK's transport emissions are more emissions than our rail and bus network. So I'm just kind of interested in what you think the overall reduction is going to be by passing this piece of legislation today.
Again, I don't have an estimate of the particular emissions reduction associated with this, but certainly if there's information on that, probably actually likely to be in a UK-wide area, but we can write to the committee. Now, all these very detailed questions on very specific issues, I'll be able to go back and get a letter to the committee if we have got that information. But I've obviously just got information on the instrument with me today.
Mark.
Yeah, I'm interested in how the decarbonisation that will occur as a result of this will link into the climate change plan. Because we've just been scrutinising the climate change plan. I don't think there's a particular figure in there for shipping, unless shipping is different to maritime. So again, it's just, there's no assumption of carbon reduction within the CCP.
No, and again, obviously I'll need to look at the climate change plan, and obviously it's a draft plan at the moment, and if we have actually got the figures associated with this particular instrument in terms of if the emissions reduction is large enough to actually make a difference to the climate change plan, and obviously as we're finalising it, we could be putting that in if it's not already there. but I don't believe it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty chunky figures here in terms of emissions, as I think, Sarah Boyack's already alluded to. So I think getting a sense of what's the cross-governmental programme around engaging with these different sectors to look at options going forward. I mean, I know that, we've got fishing down here, but there's a pelagic fleet that's largely based in Shetland where you've got quite large vessels, up to 4,000 tonnes that are doing what they do. So it feels like there's low-hanging fruit here maybe to be drawn into the climate
I will
plan.
have a look into whether an exact assessment has been done on that particular issue and get back to the committee.
Thank you, Mark. And of course, that would be helpful before we see you next week. There may be some chance to feed that in so we can consider it as part of the climate change plan. I'm sure your officials will love that. So on that note, as there's no further questions, we're going to move on to item 7, which is a debate on S6M 20456, calling for the committee to recommend that the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Extension to Maritime Activities Order 2026 be approved. Cabinet Secretary, do you want to speak to, well, you want to move the motion, do you want to speak to it? Okay. Do any members want to make a contribution to it? No. Cabinet Secretary, sum up?
No, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. The question is that S6M 20456, in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, be approved. Do we all agree? We are agreed. I'm just going to invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Are you happy? Well, if not, Mr. Matheson, as deputy convener, you can write it. I note that you are happy. And so that is all that we're going to do in public. So we're now going to move into private very briefly. Thank you.